All right. I am now joined by Philip Goff. Do you want to tell people who you are for anyone unfamiliar with you as a brand new character in the GTA extended universe?
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Good to be here chatting to you. I'm a philosophy professor from Durham University in the cold north of England. And I guess I'm mainly focused on consciousness. I've spent a lot of my career attacking physicalist views of consciousness and defending a strange view called panpsychism. But I'm interested in all sorts of questions about the nature of reality and even a bit of political philosophy every now and then. But yeah, just more recently, I suppose, which is what connected us up most recently, I've went public as embracing a heretical form of Christianity. And yeah, maybe we'll have a little chat about that today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the two do connect. So I'd like to start with the philosophy of mind.
Hmm.
So when because you have advocated this view, panpsychism, for a long time, and then my understanding is that in the course of your evolution of your views, you've linked this sort of view about consciousness to a view about the universe and the purpose of the universe that was perhaps already teetering on the edge of some sort of theism, and you have more recently outright embraced that, in an outright, albeit, as you say, in a heretical way. So let's maybe start with the view about consciousness. So when you
Hmm.
say panpsychism, what does that mean?
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe. So maybe a way into this is if you start with human consciousness, which is incredibly complex, the result of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in different shapes and sizes. The consciousness of a sheep is maybe simpler than that of a human being. The consciousness of a snail is simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. According to panpsychism, this just keeps on going down, with fundamental particles having incredibly simple forms of conscious experience to reflect their very simple physical structure. It doesn't necessarily mean literally everything is conscious. That's a common misunderstanding. It doesn't necessarily, that's kind of what the meaning of the word suggests, but it doesn't necessarily mean tables and chairs and rocks and socks are conscious. It maybe means whatever's at the fundamental level, maybe fundamental particles or maybe fields. Some theoretical physicists, probably most theoretical physicists these days actually tend to think our universe is actually made up of fields. But whatever's at the level of fundamental physics, there's very rudimentary forms of consciousness going on down there. That's the basic idea.
Okay, so there may or may not be something that it's like to be an iPhone, but there's definitely something it's like to be maybe a proton or electron, possibly a field.
Yeah. So if electrons are the fundamental things and panpsychism is true, then they're conscious. But if fields are the fundamental things and electrons are just local excitations in fields, then maybe it's just these fundamental fields that are consciousness. But basically, you can think of it like the more standard scientific worldview is that the physical world is fundamental, and then consciousness pops up out of physical processes in the brain. The panpsychist sort of turns that on its head, so that it's some story about very simple conscious things at the base of reality, and that our consciousness and the consciousness of other animals, and moreover, the entire physical world arises from these interactions of these very simple conscious entities. So it sounds a bit weird, but I actually think it's actually, when you think about it, it's a lot easier to make sense of doing things that way around, strange as it sounds to us at this present moment.
Well, okay, let's just take a minute on that then, because it seems, I mean, obviously there are sort of traditional philosophical problems about how we can be sure that, that there are other minds, but, I think we normally take ourselves to have some sort of fairly straightforward reason to think that other people are conscious, that, cats, dogs, sheep, etc., are conscious. But why exactly? Like what would the reason be to suppose that that fundamental physical fields are conscious? That's it doesn't really seem like any of our reasons for suspecting that other people and animals are conscious would apply there.
Yeah, it's a different kind of reason. And I mean, the tricky thing about consciousness, which is one of the reasons I think it's not a normal scientific problem, although the science of consciousness is an important thing. But one thing about consciousness is it's not publicly observable, right? So, I mean, I can't look in your head and see your feelings and experiences. I can't look in a fish to see whether it has feelings, experiences. I can't, and similarly, I can't look inside an electron to see if it has feelings. And it is very tricky and leads to all sorts of ethical issues that it's very hard to establish which things are or aren't conscious. All we can do, I think, is start from the human case where you can ask somebody and then try and extrapolate from there. But there is, zero consensus in the science of consciousness about what physical circumstances are required for consciousness, although the direction of travel has been incorporating more and more things. There was a recent article signed by was it dozens or even hundreds of I can't remember now, taking seriously the idea that insects are conscious. But yeah, so it's a very different kind of reason. Look, I just think the standard well, maybe we could start from the standard scientific story of things, that the physical world is fundamental and consciousness pops up. I mean, for one thing, nobody has ever managed. Oh, my email's bleeping there. Let me turn that up. No one has ever managed to make sense of that, how electrochemical signaling could somehow produce a feeling or an experience. And it's not just that we haven't got the whole story. There's not even the beginnings of an explanation. Moreover, I think there are pretty good reasons to think it's not actually coherent. Well, maybe we could get into that. So I think it's just not a coherent story that you could get consciousness in that way. Whereas I think panpsychists have worked out a coherent story, surprising as it might sound, about how you could actually get physical reality out of some story about consciousness. So basically, I think you can't get consciousness out of just physical matter, but you could get physical matter out of consciousness. So, process of elimination. So where do you want to start with that?
Gotcha.
So a negative and a positive.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that this is maybe a simple-minded question because because this is not this is not remotely my area. I'm sure I'm sure there are good responses to this, but I would think on the face of it, right, if there's this problem about how to make sense of things that are not themselves conscious, adding up to something that is conscious, which I mean, I guess you'd have to do a little bit more work to show that there was something actually incoherent there, right? I mean, you and I are visible, but we're made of things that are invisible, right? Like that, there's no incoherence there. But if there is a problem, right, it still seems like, on your view, right, because you don't want to say that tables and chairs and iPhones and all of that are necessarily conscious. So it's not just that something being made of conscious bits sort of automatically suffices to explain how that thing is conscious. So I guess I am just curious in a general sense,
Yeah.
like how sort of saying that the most fundamental building blocks have the property explains how how some larger things have that property, if not everything that's made out of those building blocks have that property. Does the question make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, just on why is the more standard view
Yeah.
incoherent? As you say, it's a huge debate, and the onus would be on me to make that case. But I mean, just there's a couple of ways into this. I mean, one way into this is just to think about what physical science is in the business of and what it's good at. And I think really, very roughly, it's all about explaining complex observable behavior in terms of simpler observable behavior. You can, or simpler behavior that's not observable for that matter. You can explain, you've got a complex system, you can postulate a mechanism, or think about the behavior of water boiling at the temperature it does. You can explain that in terms of the behavior of the underlying molecules and atoms. But that's what it's all about. And ultimately, we get to the fundamental laws of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. That's what it's all about. That's what it's good at, explaining complex behavior in terms of simpler behavior. And it's gone really well. That when you get, and that kind of information is really useful. It enables you to manipulate the world and produce wonderful technology. But I don't think that's what we're interested in when we're trying to explain consciousness. We're interested in why things feel a certain way. And that's not just about explaining some publicly observable behavior. So it's sort of like a different explanatory project. I can think by analogy, it's like telescopes have been really good in astronomy. Probably they'll be really good in pure mathematics as well, but it's just like a very different explanatory project. But anyway, we could go into that, but I admit that's just the sort of first step. But yeah, your broader question, I wouldn't say necessarily. Look, so suppose that doesn't work, the more standard option. Well, we've got to look to other possibilities. One is dualism. I don't know, that consciousness is in the soul and that's separate from the body and the brain. Okay, maybe that's a little bit not good for Occam's razor. We've got the physical world and we've got consciousness of the different things. Another possibility, which the panpsychist goes for, is, well, maybe at the fundamental level, we've just got consciousness and physical reality emerges from some story about consciousness. So it's the sort of mirror image of the materialist, more standard option. Rather than the physical world fundamental and consciousness pops out, consciousness is fundamental and physical reality pops out. And I think we know how to make sense of that. There isn't this sort of arguably incoherence, but at least nobody's got any answers in the more standard option. We know how to make sense of that. So I think panpsychism is as simple as the standard scientific option, because you've just got one kind of stuff at the bottom. It's simpler than dualism. You don't have to believe in two kinds of very different things, and we know how to make sense of it. So I think it's just looking at the different possibilities. It looks to be the most attractive because it's quite simple. We know how we've solved all the mysteries, I would say. And so, yeah, I think that's what makes it look so attractive to me.
Okay, but I mean, I guess again, I'm just wondering how it is like that. If you say like, okay, the sort of trying to explain how it is, as you say, the consciousness pops out of, complex arrangements of physical things. Like let's just say for the sake of argument that's totally hopeless, right? That they have that can't be done. That no matter how sort of elaborate a story you've told about the basic physical things and how they're sort of combined together, you haven't said anything that's illuminating to consciousness. It's like trying to use telescopes to explain basic mathematics. Even given all of that, right? I mean, I think part of the question that I was trying to get at is, how is it then that we explain that the fact that the fundamental bits are conscious, is going to explain why certain larger things are conscious, especially if it's not just automatic, right? Because I would actually understand the view slightly better if it really were the thing that you're kind of keen to differentiate it from, right? That that tables are conscious, chairs are conscious, etc. Right? That's like that on this view, literally everything is conscious. That at least there's sort of no special issue, right, about how consciousness arises. But if there is a special issue, right, that I guess I'm curious about why claiming that the fundamental building blocks are conscious helps, right?
Yeah.
If if I if there were some if some animal turned out to have the property of invisibility, like like a la comic book superpower, right? It was like our size, but it was invisible. Then and we were trying to explain how that happened. It doesn't seem like the fact that it was ultimately made of protons and electrons that were themselves invisible would do much heavy lifting in explaining that.
Yeah, good. No, I see what you're saying now. And I think what you're pointing to is probably the most discussed challenge to panpsychism, what's become known as the combination problem. Okay, you got these little conscious things. Well, how do you put them together to make a big conscious thing? And some people have pressed kind of maybe what you're hinting at there, that this is just as deep a mystery as the traditional, let's call it physicalism, the standard view that you've got physical stuff and then you get consciousness comes out of that. I mean, actually, some of my earliest publications were before my conversion to panpsychism. We're pressing some of these challenges and saying, is this really an advance? One of my first papers was called "Why Panpsychism Doesn't Help Explain Consciousness," actually, one of my most cited papers. And so I've sort of set myself a challenge and then spent the rest of my life trying to address it. One of my recent papers was called "How Panpsychism Helps Explain Consciousness." But look, it's a deep problem, and some panpsychists have given interesting ways of trying to address that. Luke Roloffs has a very reductionist view of panpsychism, really tries to tell a very reductionist story where you've just got conscious particles, you stick them together, and you get my consciousness. So it's like physicalism, it's like a very reductionist view, but just with conscious particles. But look, suppose that doesn't work out. I mean, I'm increasingly attracted to the view that it doesn't work out. And you just have to add an extra primitive that, conscious particles just have this basic capacity to combine in certain circumstances. So it's a sort of extra primitive. You've not just got conscious particles, you've got this primitive capacity to combine. And then you might say, well, what's the attraction of panpsychism? Well, I would say there's still a very serious attraction to panpsychism, which is that we can explain physical reality in terms of consciousness. So the point is, it's another common misapprehension. The physicist Sabine Hossenfelder, who I know you've written about when I had a long argument with her about something different. But I mean, she was interpreting panpsychism saying, well, you have the physical properties, mass, spin, and charge, and these extra consciousness properties. And she says, why didn't they show up in our experiments? That's not the view. That's not the view. The view is at the fundamental level, you've just got consciousness, and the physical properties like mass, spin, and charge arise from that. So I think that's a really important explanatory advantage, even if we have to add an extra primitive to get our consciousness. So basically, look, you've just got to look at these different options. Which, by the way, I think the scientific data, people think physicalism is the scientific option. I think the scientific data is just neutral on all of these. So look at the different options. The physicalist view, I think that's incoherent. Big debate, but I think it's incoherent. Certainly no one's managed to make sense of it, at any rate. You've got dualism. I think that's a coherent possibility, but it's a bit, goes against Occam's razor. Whereas we've got panpsychism, you've just got consciousness at the base. And you get physical reality out of that. That makes it more attractive than dualism. So the fact that you can get physical reality out of it, if you can, which I think you can, makes it more attractive than dualism. The fact that it's coherent makes it more attractive than physicalism, even if we have to add an extra primitive to get from the little particle, conscious particles, to our consciousness, I still think it's more attractive than the other two options.
Okay. Last question about that before we move on. If you have this kind of like deep primitive fact, nothing more to be said about it, that like certain kinds of combinations of fundamental physical particles that, you know, are fundamental fields or whatever it is, right? You know, but that they have that certain combinations of, I should say, to make sure I'm correctly representing the views, right? You know, certain combinations of ultimately conscious fundamental building blocks, right? Under, you know, under just some circumstances, produce larger conscious composites. Why doesn't the physicalist get to do that, right? Like why is physicalism that incoherent? Why can't they say that they have it's just this sort of deep primitive fact about the universe that certain combinations of non-conscious fundamental elements add up to consciousness?
Good. That's a good question. And I would say that wouldn't be physicalism if you added that. That would be basically the dualist view adopted by David Chalmers. So David Chalmers, very influential philosopher of consciousness, and he calls himself a naturalistic dualist.
Mm-hmm.
Which means he thinks consciousness is non-physical, but there are these special but he wants to bring it into the domain of science and law-governed activity. So he thinks there are these special psychophysical laws that ensure that when you've got, so that's the extra primitive, if you like, when you've got the right sort of physical stuff, consciousness pops up. So he doesn't think, you know, God is adding a soul conception. Because of these primitive laws, when you get the right physical stuff, consciousness pops out. And the view I think you've just described, which is adding a primitive, I would think that's just David Chalmers' dualism. And why I think panpsychism is more attractive is that on the panpsychist view, even if you add the primitive, you don't have two kinds of thing. On David Chalmers' naturalistic dualism, you've got two radically different kinds of thing, physical stuff and consciousness stuff. But on the panpsychist view, at the bottom, you've just got consciousness stuff and physical reality emerges from that. So I don't think what you describe would be physicalism. I mean, it's just terminological, but what physicalists aim for is a very reductionist story where you've just got, you know, I mean, I've debated, people might be interested. There's a debate on YouTube, me and the physicist Sean Carroll. You know, and he's very clear that his views that there's just, really, in some sense, there's just protons and neutrons. And, well, actually, he thinks at the fundamental level, there's just a vector in high dimensional space, which is kind of weird. I have all sorts of trouble with getting anything out of just being a vector in high dimensional space. I've got a paper on consciousness and quantum mechanics. People might be interested as well on my website. Anyway, but I've got rambling a bit now.
Yeah,
but yes, so he's very clear. Sorry, just to finish off the point. You've just got that, and everything else is just different ways of describing that. So when we talk about conscious beings, it's just different ways of describing that. You know, it's nothing more than that stuff, really. In the way a party is nothing more than people dancing and drinking. So that's the physicalist position, I think. Gone.
Yeah. Right. So I suppose, right, whether what I just described would be physicalism or not would depend on whether you think that when they add up to something that is conscious, that, you know, we're still ultimately talking about something that counts as being physical or not. And, you know, so I take your point, right, that maybe it's more like a form of dualism. Okay. So, you know, a while back, you mentioned your initial skepticism about panpsychism combined, and then your conversion to panpsychism. And of course, I'd like to move on as we move into the second half of this to your conversion to Christianity, which is also is also more comfortable terrain for me because I've spent a lot more time thinking about Christianity than I have thinking about panpsychism, but for sort of culturally obvious reasons. But I'd like to set this up just a little bit because it seems to me that, you know, when analytic philosophers argue about religion, in my experience at least, the overwhelming majority of the time, people are taking, basically one of two positions, right? Either they're atheists or agnostics, right? They're non-believers, or they're defending a very like straightforward orthodox version of, usually Christian theism, sometimes Jewish or Muslim or what have you theism, that is, that's where you say that the universe is created by God, who's separate from the universe, who's non-physical, who's all PKG, right? All powerful, all knowing, all good. And in fact, I mean, it's, something in the, the essay that I wrote responding to something that I said is that it's, like it's sort of polarized between these things in a way that's almost sort of philosophically unnatural, because like usually when there's like a long running debate about something, people are sort of migrate over the logical space, taking all the different positions that you could take on the topic. And in this case, for what I suspect are more sort of sociological reasons, right? Than philosophical ones, you don't get that effect nearly as much, right? That they have that because, very often times theistic philosophers tend to be, I mean, in fact, in many cases, they're even like affiliated with religious colleges or universities where you have to sign a faith statement to have a job there, and which is not to say they're being insincere, but like that there's a sort of straightforward, non-philosophical explanation of how you tend to produce people who have this one particular view. But all of which is just to say that one of the things that I found interesting about your article about this, right, my leap across the chasm, is that you're not defending that view, right? I mean, you kind of have an origin story as far as this goes that is familiar to many people who become atheists or agnostics, which you can maybe get into, and you have, and you're not converted to some like very recognizable, straightforward kind of Orthodox Christianity. You have this other sort of position that makes sense to you. So if you want to kind of set this up with how, like, what your previous views were, and then what you now think.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I guess it's a lot of ways I could come at this. I suppose that I was raised Catholic in terms of my history, but I rejected that when I was like 14. Mixture reasons, some intellectual reasons, the problem of evil, some ethical, I guess, thinking Christianity has backwards views on women and sexuality and so on. But also I think
Standard combination.
Say again?
A pretty standard combination, yeah.
And also, I think Christianity just seemed very unspiritual. It just seemed like Buddhism seemed spiritual, but Christianity seemed all about, doing what the old guy in the sky wants so you get to heaven. And it seemed all about sin, And but yeah, I think I think behind this change, there's kind of intellectual reasons and more spiritual reasons. And the intellectual reasons you've sort of touched on there. We have this endless debate between theists and atheists that seems to go on and on and on, and no one agrees. And I just slowly came to think that actually both sides have something right and something wrong. And I think there's things traditional theism can't explain, like most obviously the horrific suffering we find in the world. Why would a loving, all-powerful God allow that? But I also think there's things traditional atheists can't explain, such as, for example, the fine-tuning of physics for life that maybe we'll get onto. And I think there are hugely neglected middle ground options. For example, I really like the hypothesis of a God of limited power, a good God who's just not all powerful. And I think this can elegantly explain both of these data points I've just referred to. We can explain fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes, and we can explain suffering in terms of God's limitations. So I really do think, actually, to the unbiased mind, obviously it's a huge debate, but I think the evidence is really pointing at something like this. So this is what led to my book, Why the Purpose of the Universe, which is probably behind me somewhere. Quick advert there. Which is, exploring these middle ground options. And then the later point, I suppose, was, so there's nothing about this heretical Christianity in that book. The later point was, just finding out the diversity of forms of Christianity, in particular the mystical traditions of Christianity, which have always been there, going right back to the start, but which are perhaps more pronounced in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So, when I thought, when I was in my Catholic upbringing, I thought Christianity was all about sin, and it was all about just basically God punished Jesus for our sins so we don't have to go to hell, right? But actually, that, that view came from the Protestant reformers 500 years ago, although something kind of similar in Anselm 1,000 years ago. I saw actually in your post on this, you said, oh, well, wasn't it Augustine? I would say Augustine, and it's an important point, but I think I would say Augustine is more original sin, which I also don't like. But and then we get the sort of God punishing Jesus for our sins through Anselm and then the Protestant reformers. But actually, the Eastern Orthodox Church has none of this, right? None of this. It's all about, the Jesus stuff is all about God and the universe becoming one, God and humanity entering into a state of deep unity. The idea is, through Jesus, God shares in our form of existence so that we can share more deeply in God's form of existence. And, this kind of really deeply resonated with me made a lot more spiritual sense to me on that level. But also, I think actually fits quite well with this God of limited powers hypothesis that I was already thinking was intellectually attractive. So yeah, so something about the two together. Just finally, I've been talking too long. I also want to emphasize, which I think is quite important, I'm still very uncertain about all of this. I'm not even sure I'd say I believe Christianity. Karen Armstrong, in her interesting book, The Case for, not a good title, The Case for God. You think it's going to be some proof of God's existence or something, which is not at all. But she argues actually the focus on the equation of faith with belief is a sort of modern corruption. So, I actually prefer to think of faith as more like hope or trust. And I think evidence is important, but I think all you need is really to get to the point where it's a credible possibility. So I suppose I've come to think that this form of Christianity I adopt, which is very close in some ways to the Eastern Orthodox view, is so it's not kind of some totally new invented thing, although there are some, tweaks around the edges. I now think it's like a credible possibility, and that's enough for me to have faith in it. Well, actually, one more quick thing you just talked about, just because you mentioned people signing a creedal statement to be part of a university. The liberal Christian theologian Thomas Ord, who also is one of the few like me who defends a God of limited power. He was doing it before me, actually. He was not only kicked out of his university, but also his church, his form of Christianity, the Nazareans, I think they're called. He was found guilty of heresy, more for his views on LGBT stuff. But yeah, so that's a very concrete example of that.
Gotcha. Yeah. So this is something that I was a little. Again, I don't. Cards on the table. I have to say. My instinct is that the idea that that there's of God, Jesus dying for our sins does seem to be very deeply embedded in pre-Protestant Christianity. There's famously, Catholic imagery full of emphasis on the suffering of Jesus on the cross. But I'll just give you the history of Christianity for the sake of argument, because I'm certainly in no position to dispute it. But on that view, okay, I can understand this as a view of the incarnation, that Jesus, God becomes Jesus in order to partake of our form of existence, so we can therefore partake of his. I could even see how maybe it would actually be easier to make sense of that on a limited God view than an omnipotent God view. But what on this view, why do you actually need crucifixion? Like why, what's the point of the suffering and death if how does that actually help you to partake in God's form of existence?
Yeah, that's a good point. Just quickly going back to
Sure.
has it been part of the history? Just to give one example, a very conservative
Okay.
public Catholic, Trent Horn. If you ever seen Trent Horn's channel, he's very, very very conservative. But he would say he doesn't accept penal substitution. It's never been official Catholic view or anything. Yes, focus on sin and the focus on Jesus suffering, and it deals with our sin. Sure, it deals with our sin, but the idea that that transaction is about Jesus being punished in our place, I would say. Anyway, but yeah, sorry. That's a good question.
Well, actually, having said that, this is not polemical. I'm genuinely curious how the view fits together. What's like, so if you are this is kind of one of the cliches about Catholicism at its sort of most grim and regressive is the sort of people being made to like children, being made to feel feel guilty about this, like nuns, telling them Jesus did all that for you, think about how much he suffered on the cross. So I'm willing to take your point that this sort of very specific doctrine of substitutionary atonement, right, that Jesus is being punished for you, might not be something might not be what's ultimately going on there on some theologically orthodox Catholic accounts. But if not, what is the relationship between those things?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I suppose broadly this view that's close to Eastern Orthodox churches is called the participatory view, that it's about God through Jesus sharing in our form of existence. So I suppose part of that is sharing in suffering, sharing in death. I suppose it would be about that, more sharing more deeply in what it is to be a human being. I'm attracted to the idea that the part of the crucifixion is a sort of statement of cosmic solidarity. What I've always loved about Christianity is the political symbolism, that we're identifying God not with the king in the castle, but with the naked executed peasant, subjected to this cruel punishment of the empire. That this peasant is Lord rather than Caesar. I think that was an important political thing for the early Christians. And we forget we get used to crucifixion because thinking about it in terms of Jesus, and it becomes a bit sanitized, but it was just the most degrading, humiliating form of punishment, and some very early ways of mocking Christians, drawing attention to this, having sort of guy on a cross with a donkey's head or something. This is just absurd ridiculousness. So I don't know. There's a lot that's very mysterious here, but I suppose it would be something with those two things, that it's sharing in the human condition and a statement of God's values, I suppose.
Okay. Fair enough. So just to be clear, that perhaps on various forms, like various traditional views that are not about substitutionary atonement, perhaps there's some sense in which God through Jesus is participating in the suffering that's like brought about by our sins, right? So they're like I'm literally just trying to understand how how the traditional view goes, if it's not substitutionary atonement. But on your view, right, it would be, or at least the sort of, I mean, granted that you're not claiming to have like a fully developed view that you're confident about here, right? But like the sort of view you're attracted to, right? It would be something, it would be something like cosmic solidarity, that God is going to suffer with us as part of his participation in our existence.
Yeah, and I suppose it's about forming a connection. But I mean, God is very different to us. I don't know about you, it's different to me.
Sure.
No,
Yeah.
Is this just timeless, transcendent source of all being?
Yeah.
And so the idea is forming, it's very mystical, the Eastern Orthodox way of thinking about things. It's forming a deeper connection. And I suppose part of that is God experiencing what it's like to be a human being. Actually, it's a very interesting paper by a much more traditional Catholic philosopher than me. His name escapes me right now. Connecting this to the Mary thought experiment, coming back to consciousness, this classic thought experiment about Mary, this colorblind scientist who knows all the scientific facts, but she's been raised in this black and white room, so she doesn't know what it's like to see red. And the thought is, there's something missing there until she actually sees red. So he says, well, maybe, for God to really have to be omnipotent, God would have to, the only way you can know what it's like to be a human being is to become a human being and know what it's like to suffer. And yeah, so something about that. I think it's
Okay. Well, that definitely satisfies my curiosity about that. So, all right. So I want to, because I know we don't have that much time left, and I think these are both sort of important points and worth hitting. You said earlier that the kind of, I mean, granted granted that you're not claiming here to have a sort of knockdown case for this view of the kind that like any sufficiently rational person would therefore have to adopt it, right? But just to sort of have arguments in light of which it's plausible enough that it would be sort of reasonable to have faith in, right? But in terms of how those arguments work, right? So I think I heard you say two things about, kind of what you think the two sides of the more usual debate about philosophy of religion have, right? And so on the atheist side, it's about, the problem of evil giving us a reason to think that there isn't an all-powerful and all-good God. And on the theist side, you mentioned cosmic fine-tuning, which my understanding is that the recent book that you mentioned, Why, right? That quite a bit of that is about this cosmic fine-tuning problem, and so the God of limited powers is supposed to solve both of those problems in one go, right? So maybe let's just do. Sorry, I was just trying to think which maybe let's start with the problem of evil, because of course we can wrap that up in 10 minutes, no problem, and move on, right? But it's but I do think I do actually think in a certain sort of way, right? Like the disconnect on the on fine tuning might be more intractable. So I want to make sure that I want to make sure that we get, we get to both, right? So on the problem of evil, right? So I understand the basic move, right? Saying, okay, so we have you know, the problem of evil seems to make it, like this is the thing that you think the atheist, has a point about, right? The problem of evil seems to make it sort of fundamentally implausible to say that there is a being who's all powerful and all good because because all the standard examples, right? A perfectly benevolent being would surely want the Holocaust to have not happened, and yet it happened, right? A perfectly benevolent being would surely want, children not to painfully die of childhood leukemia, and yet they do, etc. Right? All straightforward. But if there is a being of limited power, then perhaps he would want these things not to happen, but he doesn't have. I'll just for the sake of convenience, I'll just use the male pronoun traditionally, right? I suspect that you might have issues with that, right? But like I have, but just for the sake of convenience, I'll do that. That the Spain would want to stop these things from happening, but lack the power to do so. So I mean, this sort of state of the universe as it exists might be kind of the best God can do at any given time, right? So I just want to pause to make sure, like on just that base level, I'm getting the view right.
Yeah, that's right. Just quickly on the pronoun issue. Yeah, I've been winding up people on X by saying, which pronoun should I use for God, they or she? And just, people go crazy over this. I don't know. It's about snowflakes. People just can't stand.
Well, and it is actually also an interesting tension in the views of a lot of these people because they seem to be, because like if you're like very, very, very intense as culturally conservative Christians often are, that the only sort of objectively correct way to use pronouns is to refer to biological sex, that like anything else is lying, is asking people to participate in your delusion for with you. That's like, well, surely God the Father doesn't have a biological sex, right?
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That will wind people up even more if I say that.
It's very confusing, right? How this view works. But okay. So yeah. So I just before saying anything else, I just want to make sure that I have gotten the fundamentals of the view right. Okay. So all right. Obvious, sort of simple-minded objection. Why is it that a benevolent God with limited power is a better explanation of the data than a malevolent God with limited power? Because if the sort of, it seems like the shape of the move could be the same in either direction, right? That the world, the world is full of suffering that a benevolent God doesn't have the power to prevent, or the world is full of happily playing children and puppies and single malt scotch and all these other wonderful things that the malevolent God is powerless to prevent. What's the I like. How, I mean, like, is there something that, like, on an intellectual level breaks that symmetry, or is this just a matter for faith?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, you say it's a simple-minded objection. I didn't think of it for a long time, actually. It was raised to me by my colleague and good friend Jack Symes, who's also does a lot of public philosophy, and he's got an undergraduate dissertation student working on this. Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I mean, one thing one could say is just say, yeah, these are both options. And as I said, you don't. What one needs for faith, in my view, is that it's a credible possibility, right? It doesn't mean it's more like, it doesn't even have to be more likely than not. But I guess I am inclined to think good limited God is simpler than bad limited God. I mean, I think, or maybe we'll get onto this. I think what why this fine tuning strikes us is that it's the numbers we find in physics are in the narrow range that are required for a universe where of great value, where great value is at least possible, right? Most of the other, if you just explore the possibility space you get from different values of the constants, most of them, a lot of them just have hydrogen in or just neutrons. There's just little or no value. Whereas in our universe, you have the possibility of life, intelligent life, people falling in love and writing poetry. I mean, it doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but for it to be possible, the numbers have to fall in this in a very narrow range. So I think the most straightforward explanation to capture that is if we're going for some form of theism or godlike figure, someone cares about value, right? Because it's slightly more complicated, maybe significantly more complicated to say, well, actually, it's someone who wants to create these valuable things to kind of fuck around with them, to mess around with them. Also, I think I'm not saying it's not an option, but you get in a more complex psychology, I think. Then I think it's just the idea that it's just a being that's perfectly good, but with limited powers, I think is simpler. What do you think? I'm not sure.
I guess the reason I'm not sold on that is that it's, it seems to me that if we're taking malevolence seriously, right, then if you're just creating a bunch of universes like I don't know if you saw Everything Everywhere All at Once, but there's the scene in there where the characters on entering that universe just become rocks because that's all that exists in that universe. And there's a line about how most of the universes are like this, right? There's nothing very interesting here at all. And of course, the sort of things that people say when they're setting up fine-tuning arguments, my understanding of the claim, right, which obviously this is something you've spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about, but is that we're talking about all these universes where we don't even have rocks, right? Like that they have, because like even that is like a sort of complex arrangement of physical constituents. You wouldn't even have that, right? So okay, you'd maybe have, actually, I suppose, combining it with panpsychism, do you have consciousness of an incredibly rudimentary form in every universe, but just not interested enough consciousness to be valuable or to be more valuable?
I suppose I don't think panpsychism is necessarily true, but assuming we're thinking of things in panpsychist terms, then if you had different values of the constants, you still have consciousness, but of just very, very simple, almost no complexity. With hydrogen, you could just go one chemical reaction. If you're still just neutrons, you've got no chemical reactions. If the cosmological constant was a bit weaker, the universe would have collapsed back on itself after a split second. So, so consciousness, but still,
right,
nothing of much value.
Okay, so all right, so here's I was going to say why I'm not sold on the sort of value as the symmetry breaker. That I think, even assuming panpsychism, and I think I just heard you say that it could be that in some of these it's if panpsychism isn't necessarily true, that they have a lot of these universes, maybe whatever does exist isn't conscious even in rudimentary form, but whatever, putting all that aside, right? Even if we do assume, rudimentary consciousness for whatever exists, look, on panpsychism even, I'm not doing anything malevolent if I just kick some rocks, right? I haven't caused any negative value. I haven't, I certainly haven't caused any suffering, when I do that. So it seems to me that a malevolent being of limited power who creates a universe that doesn't have any consciousness, or at least no, interest in consciousness, is there's sort of no scope of action for malevolence, that that they have, if you you haven't, you don't have any victims, whereas if you have a universe where you have all of these, of course most of it isn't interestingly conscious, but although that point cuts both ways, right? Because a benevolent being would presumably want there to be more interesting consciousness, and and interestingly conscious beings were flourishing and all of that, right? But like, if you have a world that at least this one little part of it is full of things that are conscious, that has the potential for some of these things to be conscious in those special ways that humans are, that that sheep, for example, are not, right? Then look, that opens up whole new vistas of suffering, right? I mean, that there is, I mean, this is something that so much literature is about, right? That humans have the capacity to suffer in utterly unique ways, because we're aware of our own mortality in ways that nothing else that's mortal is. So it seems to me that if that a malevolent fine tuner would have much the same motivation, right, in his own direction, to want to want a world in which you had not only life but advanced and complicated forms of consciousness, to have a sort of scope for being able to be malevolent, because otherwise you're just sort of being neutral.
Yeah, no, I think I wouldn't dispute anything you've just said, and yeah, that's why I think it is a possible explanation. I suppose I was just suggesting that such a god would have a slightly more complex psychology. I mean, what might be going on in the background here, which is coming to another background assumption. I mean, I'm a sort of objectivist about morality and on independent grounds, and part of that, I reject the standard Humean view about motivation, which is that motivation just bottoms out in just basic desires. That's the fundamental story. And Hume thinks every action has a belief and a desire. I reject that, actually. I think a lot of what we do because we think it would be a good thing to do, or it would be worth doing. And we might not have a desire, at least if by desire can mean lots of things, but at least by desire we're meaning like a kind of yearning for something. And maybe this is sort of definitional of the human condition in a way. You think, you've got a strong desire to cheat on your partner or something, but you think it's the wrong, judge that it's the wrong thing to do, and there's a clash there. And then Humeans say, well, that's a desire, isn't it? If you well, why should it be? Why can't it just be a judgment that it's the wrong thing to do? But and I don't desire it at all, in a sense of consciously yearning. So I suppose this might reflect my moral objectivism, that I think a lot of why we do bad stuff is because we've got desires, because this is the clash between doing stuff because you desire it and doing stuff because you think it's worth doing. So I think of the way I think about God, I think God doesn't have desires, right? God just does what's worth doing. God's just sort of freed up from that. So that's definitely simple. If you have that admittedly debatable meta-ethical view, then I would say it's plausibly much simpler to just say a good God who's just no desires, just does the right thing under certain limitations. Whereas a bad God would have to have desires. And I think so that would lead to a more complex psychology. But admittedly, there's debatable assumptions there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder why there's like even sort of granting like even sort of granting the meta ethics, right? Like I wonder why it is that that having that a being like whose whole being was oriented around doing the objectively right thing, right, is sort of simpler than a being whose whole being is oriented around around doing the objectively wrong thing, right? Like that's I mean, maybe there's a reason why one of those is more straightforward, but I mean, just on the face of it, I guess I'm not sure.
Yeah, just doing. I suppose it's rooted in a understanding of what rationality is in a very broad sense of rationality. It's about responding to reasons, and then that's messed up a bit because we have non-rational, irrational desires. But
Yeah.
if you're, I suppose that if you're just doing what do you, the wrong thing, what's that? You're not responding to reasons. You're doing sort of the opposite of what you have reason to do, or something. It's a good point, though. Yeah.
Okay, well, fair enough.
Think more
So,
about that.
I know we need to wrap up, but I do. I do just want to not completely leave this out of the discussion, right? Because I think it is I think it is a fundamental and interesting point of disagreement, and I also know from long experience talking to people about this that I think that I might just sort of have uh, kind of perverse intuitions about this. There might be something that like everybody else is getting that I'm not, right? But on fine tuning, right? If you say, right, like I you have you have a randomly shuffled deck of cards, and you get the ace of spades. It would surely be a very bad inference to say that uh, it must have actually not been randomly shuffled after all, right? There must have been cheating to make sure you got it. One way of seeing why this is a very bad inference is if we don't bring in any other assumptions, right? Beyond, deck of cards, dealt one out, it was this. Then any card that I got, right, would you'd make the same, like that argument, oh, it must have been not randomly shuffled really, but like there really must have been elaborate cheating to get me this card. Like all 52 arguments would be equally good, right?
Yeah.
And so sort of one basic way of seeing the motivation for skepticism about fine tuning is that if you have not 52 cards or 52 billion cards or 52 trillion cards, but a number of cards that that the human mind can't comprehend, that is just sort of an utterly brain melting number of cards. This sort of basic point still applies, right? That like whatever universe you end up with could be taken as evidence for a fine tuner who wanted that particular universe,
Yeah.
and not others. And I guess maybe actually what you just said a minute ago about the malevolent God does help me understand the way you would respond to this, but I think it'd be interesting to hear from you and explicitly, right? That that why is it that it's sort of because I understand that you could say, oh, this is that this is in the teensy tiny number of possible, the impossibly tiny fraction of possible universes that have the potential for life, never mind sort of complicatedly conscious life like us, and that's but I would think that you could find all sorts of maybe uninteresting ways to divide up any range into like little teeny bits, right? That they have like you could have it could be the case that I don't know, if you have that that like if it turned out that the number of particles in the universe was prime or something like that, right? That they have that like there are all sorts of ways that like it could be that you could describe a given universe so that there are only like there's only some tiny fraction of the range that have that property, but that doesn't sort of
Yeah.
cry out for a fine-tuning explanation. But why is it that it's reasonable to think that the fact that our universe has the potential for interestingly complicated consciousness is a reason to think that it's fine-tuned. I know there was a lot going on there, but I think the thrust of the worry I hope is clear.
Yeah, no, it is. That's good. I mean, what one philosopher pushed this by saying, I can't remember who now, why don't we worry the universe is fine-tuned for tungsten?
Yeah.
We wouldn't know. But yeah, no, I mean, you raise an important point. I think, as I think you maybe hinted at a bit in your post on this, it's something I think it falls on whether there's something of objective significance about the outcome, independently of it just happening to be the outcome. So coming to your card analogy, right? If it's just whatever, one card that has no significance, then, we won't think there's cheating. But if it's the one card I needed to win, and I don't know, and it keeps coming up again and again, then it has significance. And so we'll start to think, oh, there's some cheating going on here, maybe. Or if, the person who wins the lottery is the partner of the person who runs the lottery, then we start to get suspicious. So I think I would say the as I said earlier, the numbers that come out are the ones that are compatible with value emerging. Now you might say in response to this, well, hold on, I don't believe in objective value, right? I think, that's just a human projection or whatever. Two things in response to that. I mean, firstly, the belief in objective value is much less controversial among philosophers than the belief in God, right? So, what does Russell say? You want an argument with less controversial premises and a more controversial conclusion. So even if this argument hangs on there being objective facts about what's valuable and what's not, I still think it's an interesting argument if you can get something goddish out of the end. But actually, one thing I say in my book, which if I may say, I think is maybe a little bit more of an original, I feel like I'm showing off now, an original twist on the argument. I suggest maybe we can build a commitment to objective value into the hypothesis we're defending, right? So you say the hypothesis is that there is objective value, and that, there's a being created the universe who's interested in that. And so then you use the evidence of fine-tuning to support that hypothesis. It sounds a little bit like cheating, but I don't think it is. So yeah, that's the
okay. That's fair. So yeah, I think that does I think that does help a lot. I am, whether, I know you'll be devastated to learn that I haven't exited this conversation as a convinced panpsychist heretical Christian. But I do think I have a better sense of how the views hang together now.
I liked very much the title of your post saying, "I'm still an atheist, but Philip Goff's version of Christianity sounds lovely." That's enough for me.
It does.
But let me just say, actually, I'm currently writing a book on not specifically on Christianity, but reimagining religion. I've just started, probably about a year and a half till it comes out. But I'm really aiming actually at the spiritual, but not religious, and want to sort of just suggest in a non-pressury way that there are perhaps ways you could engage with traditional religion, Christianity or Judaism or Islam, which you could get something out of. You can get a community, you can get structure, you can get a rich tradition, and you can, by engaging with the mystical traditions that you get in all those religions. You got Kabbalah in Judaism, you got Sufism in Islam, and, there are ways of having a liberal approach to ethics and avoiding those, engaging in a more open-minded way that's not so dogmatically certain. So I suppose, that's what I'm trying to convey, that there's a different way of engaging with Christianity, for example, that is not, what people think of as evangelical US Christian who thinks, you shouldn't have gay sex, and good job Jesus took our punishment or we'll all burn forever. I was debating
Yeah, that doesn't
William
sound.
Lane Craig
That's
last week, the most well-known exponent of evangelical Christianity. Great philosopher, I think, and we had a fiery debate that should come out in a few weeks. But yeah, there are other ways of thinking about Christianity, and an Eastern Orthodox isn't just some random fringe position. I mean, I know I'm going beyond Eastern Orthodox. I'm an Anglican actually, or Episcopal in the US context. But it's a major way Christianity has always been that is very different to this sin orientated thing.
fair enough. Well, I look forward to watching the Craig debate. That actually sounds really fun. Philip, where can people check out your work? What should they read? What do you want to direct people to?
Thanks. Well, I suppose the two books aimed at general audience, the Why, modestly titled Why the Purpose of the Universe, for this stuff we've been talking about, the more between God and atheism, or Galileo's Error is more on the panpsychism consciousness stuff. I mean, they both talk about panpsychism consciousness a little bit. If you're an academic philosopher, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality is my academic book on the panpsychism stuff. But anyway, more generally, I suppose, Philip Goff, philosophy.com. My website, lots of stuff on that. Spend too much time arguing on X and Blue Sky. Well, all the liberals have moved to Blue Sky, and so I'm doing both. I don't know. It's difficult to know what to do. People shout at me for still being on X, but I don't know. I worry about this divided community. So I'm. It's interesting the responses you get, the different responses you get on X and Blue Sky to that God's pronouns thing. On Blue Sky, people were like, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And then on X, people were like, you fucking... Anyway, but if you want to argue with me on either of those, Philip_Goff on X. Philip with one L. But I've got a Substack I try to do a little bit.
All right. Well, we'll put links to that in the description. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Really enjoyable conversation. Keep up the good work.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.